It's a real pleasure. Thank you, Christian, for co-organizing this for the third time. It is a pleasure to be here, and it is a pleasure to see so many people interested in this event, which by now has a certain brand name, and you have just gone through the history of several years of surprises that we have had and that have made this event so important. And people freeing up their agenda to come is, of course, our biggest reward. My role here is to, on the one hand side, represent the CEPR and concretely to present to you a very recent, actually published last week, book on the economic consequences of the second Trump administration, which is co-edited by Gary Gensler, Simon Johnson, and Ugo Bonizza. And it is a rapid response report of CEPR in the following sense. We put together more than 50 authors, 40 chapters in 2 months. And the brief to the authors was, give us your first impression. We all understand that we don't know yet what the ultimate outcomes will be, but this is a preliminary assessment across the board from different sectors and different policies. So what I'm going to give you is some of the highlights from our introduction, but I do encourage you, it's a free ebook as we do at CEPR. We work for you, so you can download it for free from the CEPR website. Here are a few highlights. The most notable, what any observer will have would agree with of the Trump 2025 administration. The most notable feature is the high level of uncertainty and of institutional uncertainty, here illustrated simply in the sheer number of executive orders that were issued within the first 3 months of this administration. It totally contrasts even with the former Trump administration, and definitely you have to go back to war times or the Great Depression in order to see similar amount of executive orders. The fact that uncertainty is actually very high, historically high, is illustrated in this chart, which is an index of trade policy uncertainty. And here what you see there is, of course, Liberation Day. Now, the Liberation Day tariffs and the way that they were implemented and then renegotiated have left people puzzling about why these tariffs, why are tariffs being, what are the ultimate goals of this administration with the tariffs? And there are different theories, different explanations that have been given. It is about balancing the deficit. It's about balancing the bilateral deficits. It's about bringing back manufacturing jobs, helping the middle class, or helping pay for large expenditures, tax reductions, sorry. And then, of course, there is always the possibility, like in any multiple choice, that it is all of the above. Now, the problem is that as economists, we really struggle to understand why tariffs should do probably any of the above, and it is even more difficult to understand how one instrument should be able to fulfill so many goals. The second amount of puzzling comes from the fact, why are they implemented in the way they're being implemented? Rather unpredictable, and if they don't work, if those goals are not achieved, what will happen then? This is all an illustration of the amount of uncertainty that is still around when it comes to tariffs. There are unintended consequences, and one of our chapter authors illustrates this with his model in which he simulates the tariffs and also the relative retreat. Bottom line message of this slide is it's negative on growth, there is higher inflation, and this is the most interesting feature of this slide. It is negative in terms of the wages, real wages, both for the unskilled and the skilled. So if the intention is that the unskilled wages should increase, this does not seem to be what we are predicting based on these estimations. Unintended consequences, this is also still very in the preliminary phase. We don't see yet in the inflation rate nor in the model-based forward-looking rates of inflation expectations, but we do see inflation expectations based on surveys increasing, and this is the year ahead, increasing quite dramatically. And in terms of growth forecasts, they have been scaled back gradually. The debt and deficit projections is another big question. What is going to happen there? The interesting part of this slide here is most on the second, on the right-hand side. You see the general government, gross general government debt of the US. And if these numbers look strange to you, it's because you are probably used to think in terms of federal debt only. But the IMF and other countries in the world, they measure and compare the gross government debt. And here in this comparison, the US has already had higher debt than the EU for a while. And you see now the projections of a steeper increase of debt going forward. We have a chapter on this which explains why the present course is not sustainable. And this may be made worse in the future if the fact that the tax collection capacity has been diminished actually impacts the revenue projection. This is also not including yet the BBB Act. Now I have something that is actually not from the book, but I found and thought it was very interesting for this audience. This is an NBR working paper that was published yesterday, and also falls into this into this question of unintended consequences here with a question mark. But the study that I'm citing here is showing the relationship between treasury convenience yields and debt, and you see that they are falling, and to this extent that this convenience yield is an expression of the exorbitant privilege of the US dollar and of the US. Falling higher debt has meant lower convenience yields. In fact, convenience yields have been falling, and therefore there is a question around the exorbitant privilege already over a longer period, but now you see them falling even more dramatically. The text on the right-hand side is from the same working paper and illustrates the context that we are talking about here. It is about the fact that the US is actually in a unique position, and the reason why there is a convenience yield is the fact that investors are prepared to hold treasuries at a lower yield because of safety, liquidity, and regulatory advantages. To the extent that these are now under question, this convenience yield is correctly disappearing. But it is also important to note that, at least in parts of the administration, this is not seen as an exorbitant privilege, but actually as a burden, an exorbitant burden for the US. Still in the same vein of unintended consequences, this is the Liberation Day reaction of the US dollar, which depreciated rather than appreciated when interest rates went up. This is the typical type of shock or typical type of reaction we would see in an emerging market to an own shock, to an own bad shock. And therefore, the question that is being asked here by probably you in the markets, but definitely by many people also beyond markets, is what does this mean? Was this a one-time, or is this indicative of a new reality in which the safe haven property of the US dollar is at least weakened, if not going away? Then the second part, or actually yes, a large part of the book is about the consequences for the wider world. The retreat from the public goods, both in terms of aid, climate, health, and I'll have a word about Europe in a moment, is notable. And these ones here are the estimates from another chapter on how much it costs in terms of annual death tolls, the cuts to AID, mostly in terms of vaccines, HIV, and humanitarian food are notable. We're talking about 500,000 of additional deaths. Well, unintended consequences of US disengaging may be, and this is not something that we see yet, that the rest of the world will have to realign, will have to reorganize, build coalitions, regional integration. But it's also notable that the US is smaller than it appears when you look at the news headlines. The US is, yes, a quarter of the global GDP. The EU and China, if measured in market rates, are equally large-sized, namely each 17% of GDP. When you look at the right-hand side, you have trade, respective on trade. One chart does not include or does basically take out intra-EU trade, so trade between France and Germany is not included. Then the EU has 12% of global trade, US and China each around 14%. If you take the trade between countries in the EU into account, then it is much larger than the EU is almost 30% of global trade. Point of this slide is there is a large rest of the world out there, which is not only being impacted by what's going on in the US, but is also will have to realign around these questions that are being asked on global commons, on global currencies, etc. My second last slide, regional integration can obviously be also an opportunity, definitely for Europe, because in Europe what is clear is that there are few alternatives. If globalization is in retreat, if the security question is being put into question, and the energy prices, as Christian already mentioned, the Draghi and the growth agenda now becomes imperative, and overcoming fragmentation becomes imperative. And what you're seeing on this slide is, on the one hand side, the fact that we have in Europe a productivity gap with the US, which is exactly the message of the Draghi report. On the other hand side, what we have also in Europe is we are imposing within European countries very high non-tariff barriers. These are here estimates based on EU, calculating a tariff equivalent of non-tariff barriers for intra-EU trade, both in manufacturing and services. And the message here is very clear. Reduce fragmentation would clearly be one of the big contributors to reducing the productivity gap. And finally, Europe, and this is being discussed in Den Haag and other places, all the time these days, Europe also needs to overcome its fragmentation when it comes to its own defense challenge. And there is about 5 chapters in the book that I am talking about that deal with this and how to do it. So thank you very much.